Growing up in the Unitarian Universalist faith, I was taught to learn about established structures with an open mind and to assert my boundaries and communicate my needs. I learned how to find a way for myself in the world that felt right for me. These lessons have given me a reliable set of tools for navigating the world. We've talked about our interconnected web as both ecological and human, and gender is one part of how we interact with each other. It is embedded deeply in how we know ourselves, how we interact with each other, and how we shape our society. Understanding this component of our interconnected web and how we fit into it is an important part of understanding the ecosystem of our society. But even if all this seems distant or out of reach right now, we can fall back on the inherent worth and dignity of every person and compassion in human relations. And the central part of the new proposed values of our UUA covenant, love. We can approach these unknowns from a place of openness, compassion, and love. Part of this journey is learning the ways to express that love to each other in ways that feel comfortable to each of us. The framework of the UU principles and the skills I learned growing up were part of the toolkit I needed when I started out exploring my own gender identity. I use they, them pronouns and introduce myself that way. But honestly, the pronouns I use are a small part of the collective whole that is my gender. My gender is a messy and beautiful interaction that encompasses so much more. It's my sexuality, my fatness, my love of loud earrings and oversized sweaters, and all the ways I was taught how to be. I use the prefix trans to describe my gender, for me, not as in across, but through. I move through gender. Trans as in transient, transcendent, transformational. In her 1998 book, Trans Liberation, Beyond Pink or Blue, Leslie Feinberg writes, "Gender is the poetry each of us makes out of the language we are taught." Gender is the poetry each of us makes out of the language we are taught. Gender is not something we are born knowing or understanding. It is something we're taught. Many of us probably have memories about how we learned the rules around gender. Boys should play with trucks, girls should play with dolls, boys should grow up to be athletes, businessmen, or doctors, girls should grow up to be mothers, nurses, or teachers. Boys shouldn't cry, and girls shouldn't get angry. We learn these oftentimes through trial and error, through how people respond to our behavior. Sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes not so much. Knowing these rules isn't inherent at birth. It's something we learn as we grow up. And these rules depend on how you grow up. The expectations surrounding gender are very different depending on your race, class, and culture. We use the tools we are provided with to make our way in the world. For some of us, this has meant having to stick very closely to expectations of gender to keep us safe. For some of us, it has meant divesting ourselves from these expectations. The language we are all taught is shaped by a lot of circumstances and by people's expectations of us based on how they perceive our gender. So what does it mean to make poetry out of this language? Part of it is learning what the language is that you're working with, understanding what rules you are and are not following, and figuring out if those rules make sense for you. Can you think of some ways you follow the gender rules? Can you think of some ways that you break them? As I started exploring gender for myself, I didn't stop wearing dresses. I did, however, stop wearing clothes meant to restrict my body size or shape. I now shop for different items of clothes in different sections of the store based on how I like my clothes to fit, not how clothing companies think clothes should fit a body like mine. For me, poetry means listening to my own experience and trusting myself. I can stay close to aspects of the gender I was taught that feel right to me and let go of those that don't. I can also be intentional about learning new languages of gender and looking for language in new places. The form of this poem might be gender norms, and the style might be a broad spectrum between femininity and masculinity. Maybe the words are expressions of gender, and maybe the deeper meaning is a sense of identity. Writing our own poetry, we would certainly each have our own interpretations, and each person would find styles that feel more like home for them. Maybe the writing is flowery and verbose, or maybe it's dense and concise. Maybe the words on the page make a shape, and maybe reading it feels like singing. Maybe writing poetry feels natural, or maybe it feels clunky and out of practice. Maybe your poetry fits a traditional style, or maybe it takes a form of its own. Whatever your poetry, it is uniquely yours, shaped by the language you know and what you've been taught, but maybe it's also something a little bit new. A lot of times when we talk about blue crayons with red labels, we talk about how hard it is to not be able to draw a red strawberry and the pressure from other crayons to get it right. But what if we focus on the drawings at the end? The blue crayon didn't change himself, but his outlook. He recognized that his strengths were in drawing the sky and the ocean. He may find sometimes that he likes drawing blue strawberries too. There is beautiful poetry in that wide open sky at the end. And there is poetry in the very crayon asking for help with the ocean. I wonder what other kinds of poetry that little crayon will go on to write.